Hey guys, tonight we begin with medieval menstruation. And trust me, it's way more scandalous than your high school health class ever prepared you for. If you think modern period talk is awkward, wait until you hear what medieval girls went through every month. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Because we're about to dive into a topic that medieval society simultaneously ignored, feared, and made absolutely ridiculous rules about. Let's start with the biggest misconception about medieval periods. Most people imagine medieval girls just dealt with it naturally, maybe used some herbs, lived in harmony with their cycles like earth goddesses or something. In reality, medieval menstruation was a bizarre cocktail of religious panic, medical quackery, and social isolation that would make a modern teenager weep into her heating pad. This wasn't some Zen, moon goddess situation where girls were treated to peaceful huts to commune with nature. It was more like being quarantined for a crime you didn't commit, while everyone around you debated whether you were cursed by God, possessed by demons, or just really, really unclean. Think of it like being grounded, but the grounding is based on your biology, lasts a week every month, and comes with a side of theological debate about whether you're literally toxic to plants. Medieval girls didn't have cute period tracking apps or organic cotton tampons with inspiring quotes on the wrapper. They had rags, literal rags, and a society that treated their monthly cycle like a combination of leprosy and witchcraft. If you thought explaining periods to a medieval peasant would be awkward, try explaining to them that modern women sometimes celebrate their first period with parties. They'd probably assume you were describing some kind of satanic ritual. The medieval approach to menstruation was basically, congratulations, you're now a woman. Also, you're disgusting and dangerous. Please stand over there. No, further. Keep going. There, behind that shed. Don't touch anything. Especially not the bread dough. You'll ruin it just by existing near it. The medieval period wasn't exactly the golden age of women's health education. Medieval Europe was a place where people thought bad smells caused plague, where barber surgeons were considered medical professionals, and where the standard treatment for most ailments was either prayer or bleeding. So naturally, their approach to periods was creative. Medieval society wasn't governed by medical science. It was ruled by a fascinating combination of Christian theology, ancient Greek medical texts that were about as accurate as medieval, weather forecasting, and folk beliefs that had been passed down through generations, like a really unfortunate game of telephone. The Catholic Church controlled most medical knowledge, which meant that anything related to women's bodies was automatically suspicious, sinful, or both. If you thought modern sex education was awkward, imagine getting your period education from monks who had taken vows of celibacy and genuinely believed that women were basically defective men. Their medical textbooks were written by ancient Greeks who thought the uterus could wander around the body like a lost tourist, causing hysteria wherever it went. It's like getting dating advice from someone who's never been on a date. Except, the stakes were whether you'd be considered literally cursed. Medieval physicians, and I use that term loosely, believed in the theory of humors, which suggested that the human body contained 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. They thought periods were just the body getting rid of excess blood, like a monthly oil change for women. Except instead of preventing engine problems, this maintenance apparently made women dangerous to dairy products and capable of killing plants with their gaze. The average medieval girl lived in a world where literacy was rare. Medical knowledge was based on astrology, and most health advice came from the village wise woman, who was probably just making things up as she went along. These girls had no idea what was happening to their bodies, why it was happening, or when it would stop. They just knew that once a month, they became social pariahs who couldn't touch holy objects without apparently contaminating them. Women controlled household medical care, which sounds empowering until you realize that their medical training consisted of whatever their mothers and grandmothers had told them, mixed with superstitions that had been accumulating for centuries like sediment in a river. It was like a centuries-long game of medical telephone, where the original message was probably something sensible, but by the medieval period had become, "Don't look at pickles while menstruating, or they'll explode." Meet Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century Benedictine abbess, who was basically the medieval equivalent of a wellness influencer, except actually qualified. Hildegard was a mystic, composer, philosopher, and physician who wrote extensively about women's health, which was radical for her time, like starting a feminist blog in 1150. But here's where it gets interesting. Even Hildegard, arguably the most medically knowledgeable woman of her era, had some absolutely wild ideas about periods. She believed that menstrual blood was basically liquid sign, a monthly reminder of Eve's transgression in the Garden of Eden. According to Hildegard, periods were simultaneously a punishment for original sin and a necessary cleansing process. It's like being told you need to do community service for a crime your great-great-grandmother committed. Hildegard recommended that menstruating women avoid certain foods not because of nutrition, but because she thought they're corrupt. Blood would spoil the food just by proximity. She suggested they shouldn't eat fish during their periods because the corruption might transfer to the fish, which would then corrupt whoever ate it. It's like medieval period cooties, but with actual theological implications. Despite these bizarre beliefs, Hildegard was actually progressive for her time. She acknowledged that periods were natural and necessary, rather than purely punitive. She even prescribed herbal remedies for period pain, which puts her ahead of medieval physicians, who basically just told women to pray harder. Her treatments included fennel, tansy, and other herbs that, surprisingly, modern research suggests might actually have had some beneficial effects. But the real kicker? Hildegard claimed to receive her medical knowledge through divine visions. So she was essentially saying, God told me in a dream that you shouldn't eat fish while menstruating. In medieval times, this wasn't considered crazy. It was considered a legitimate medical consultation with the highest possible authority. The contradiction is fascinating. Here was a woman who understood anatomy better than most male physicians of her time, who wrote detailed descriptions of the female reproductive system, and who genuinely tried to help other women. Yet she was still trapped in a worldview that saw periods as fundamentally connected to moral corruption. It's like being a brilliant scientist who has to frame all her research in terms of alchemy, because that's the only language her society understands. Hildegard's influence spread throughout medieval Europe, which means her period advice was being followed by nuns and noblewomen across the continent. Imagine thousands of medieval women avoiding fish once a month because a mystical abbess had a vision about it. And if you think that's impressive, wait until you hear about the village remedies that didn't have the benefit of divine inspiration. The really wild part is that Hildegard was considered the reasonable, scientific voice on women's health. If this was the progressive position, you can imagine how bizarre the mainstream beliefs were. This wasn't just about personal discomfort or inconvenience. Medieval beliefs about menstruation affected every aspect of a woman's life, from her economic opportunities to her spiritual standing in the community. A woman's period could determine whether she could work in certain jobs, participate in religious ceremonies, or even enter specific rooms in her own house. The stakes were particularly high because medieval society operated on a very narrow margin of survival. If you couldn't work during your period, that was a quarter of your productive time lost every month. For peasant families living hand to mouth, this could mean the difference between eating and starving. But the religious and social taboos meant that women had to choose between following the rules and feeding their families. These beliefs also affected women's social mobility and marriage prospects. A woman who didn't properly observe menstrual taboos could be accused of witchcraft, sacrilege, or moral corruption. In a society where reputation was everything, period-related social violations could destroy a woman's life. It's like having your entire social media presence judged based on something you have no control over, except the consequences were excommunication or execution rather than just getting cancelled. The medical consequences were equally serious. Medieval treatments for period problems ranged from useless to actively harmful. Women suffered from infections, malnutrition, and untreated conditions because the available medical care was based on superstition rather than knowledge. Many died from complications that would be easily treatable today. Perhaps most importantly, these beliefs shaped how medieval women understood themselves and their bodies. Imagine growing up being told that your natural biological functions make you dangerous, unclean, and spiritually suspect. The psychological impact of monthly shame and isolation affected generations of women who never had the chance to understand their own bodies as anything other than sources of contamination and sin. But Hildegard's divine period visions were just the tip of the iceberg. If you think a mystical abbess had strange ideas about menstruation, wait until you hear what ordinary medieval people believed. We're talking about a society that thought periods could sour wine just by looking at it, could kill flowers with proximity, and could literally prevent bread from rising. The village remedies and folk beliefs make Hildegard's fish avoidance advice look downright scientific. We're about to dive into a world where periods were treated like monthly natural disasters, complete with elaborate prevention rituals and emergency protocols. Because in medieval times, a woman's cycle wasn't just a biological function. It was a supernatural event that required careful management to prevent contaminating everything from livestock to holy water. And trust me, the solutions medieval people came up with were far more creative and disturbing than anything a modern wellness blogger has ever suggested. We're talking about remedies that involved everything from blessed herbs to actual animal sacrifice, all in the name of managing what they saw as a monthly curse that could literally poison the world around them. Medieval folk medicine and village beliefs about menstruation were like a fever dream written by someone who had never actually met a woman but had heard terrifying stories about them secondhand. Unlike our modern understanding of periods as a normal biological process, medieval villagers treated menstruation like a monthly natural disaster that required community-wide emergency protocols. The development of these beliefs was a perfect storm of ignorance, superstition, and genuine fear. Remember, this was a society where people thought eclipses were caused by dragons eating the sun, so their approach to periods was predictably creative. Village-wise women and local healers created an elaborate mythology around menstruation that combined ancient pagan beliefs, half-understood Christian theology, and observations that have been misinterpreted so many times. They bore no resemblance to reality. These weren't just medical beliefs. They were social survival strategies. In communities where everyone depended on everyone else for survival, the idea that one person could contaminate the food supply, poison livestock, or ruin crops just by existing was genuinely terrifying. So medieval villages developed complex rules and rituals designed to contain the perceived threat of menstruating women. The really fascinating part is how these beliefs created a parallel universe of women's knowledge that existed completely separate from official medical doctrine. While male physicians were debating the theological implications of periods, Village women were developing practical solutions for dealing with monthly isolation, pain management, and the logistics of continuing to work while being considered. Literally toxic. It was like having two completely different medical systems operating in the same society. The official one run by men who had never experienced periods, and the unofficial one run by women who had to deal with the actual reality of periods while navigating the social consequences of these bizarre beliefs. Take the village of Montehillo in 14th century France, which we know about in unusual detail, thanks to Inquisition records. The village wise woman, a woman named Fabris, had developed an elaborate system for managing periods that involved more ritual than a royal coronation. According to local testimony, Fabris required menstruating women to avoid the village well, stay away from the church, and sleep in a separate building during their periods. But here's where it gets weird. Fabris also insisted that menstruating women had to wear specific herbs in pouches around their necks, not to help with cramps, but to prevent their corruption from spreading to others. One herb combination included rue, which is mildly toxic, and tansy, which can cause liver damage. So the cure was literally more dangerous than the condition. It's like treating a headache with a mild concussion. The records show that Fabris charged families for these protective herb pouches, essentially creating a medieval period tax. Families had to pay extra money every month just to prevent their daughters from supposedly poisoning the neighbors. And if a family couldn't afford the herbs, well, their daughter might be blamed for any misfortune that befell the village during her period. Cow died? Must be the girl who couldn't afford proper period protection. Another fascinating example comes from England, where medieval bread-making guilds had specific rules about menstruating women. The guild records from several towns explicitly banned women from touching bread dough during their periods, based on the belief that menstrual blood would prevent the bread from rising. Some guilds went further, requiring women to declare their menstrual status before entering bakeries. One guild master in York allegedly kept detailed records of his female workers' cycles to ensure they wouldn't accidentally contaminate the bread. Imagine having your period tracked by your boss not for health benefits, but because he genuinely believed your ovaries could commit biological warfare against carbohydrates. The guild records suggest that women who violated these rules could be fined, fired, or even banned from the profession entirely. Perhaps most bizarrely, some villages developed elaborate ceremonies around first periods that were like debutante balls from hell. In parts of Germany, when a girl got her first period, the village would hold a ritual that involved parading her through town wearing specific colors, usually red, because medieval people were not subtle, while other women threw herbs and sometimes stones to drive away the evil spirits that supposedly caused menstruation. The girl would then be presented with a special belt or girdle that she was required to wear during all future periods. These belts weren't for practical purposes. They were supposedly magical protection that would contain her dangerous menstrual energy. Some of these belts included metal components, religious symbols, or were blessed by the local priest. It's like medieval period underwear, except it was supposed to protect everyone else from you, not protect you from leaks. One particularly detailed account from a monastery describes a village ceremony where the girl's family had to provide a feast for the entire village after her first period, essentially apologizing to the community for their daughter becoming a monthly biological hazard. The feast had to include specific foods that were supposed to counteract menstrual contamination, basically a medieval period neutralizing party. These weren't isolated incidents. Similar practices existed across Europe, with local variations. That somehow managed to be even more bizarre. Some villages required menstruating women to ring bells when they walked through town, like medieval period warning systems. Others had special huts where women had to stay during their periods, which sounds progressive until you realize these huts were often built downwind from the village because people thought menstrual smell could cause illness. But it wasn't that simple, because medieval society was nothing if not contradictory. While village communities were developing increasingly elaborate period containment protocols, they also relied heavily on women's labor, including during menstruation. Peasant families couldn't afford to lose a quarter of their female workforce every month, which created a fascinating tension between ideology and economic reality. The result was a complex system of selective enforcement and creative interpretation. Women found ways to continue working while technically observing the taboos, often with the tacit cooperation of their communities. A woman might be banned from touching bread dough during her period, but she could still harvest grain, thresh wheat, and carry flour. Basically, everything except the final step that would supposedly contaminate the bread. Some villages developed workarounds that were more creative than practical. Women might use tools instead of their hands for certain tasks, wear special gloves that were supposed to prevent contamination, or have other women act as intermediaries for tasks they couldn't perform directly. It was like a monthly medieval version of the floor is lava, except the lava was your reproductive system. The contradictions were even more apparent when it came to medical care. The same village-wise women who were considered dangerous during their own periods were often the ones providing medical care to others, including delivering babies and treating illnesses. Apparently, menstrual contamination was selective. It could ruin bread and kill plants, but it didn't interfere with healing the sick or delivering children. These contradictions created a parallel economy where women developed their own systems for managing work, childcare, and household responsibilities during periods. While the official rules said menstruating women should be isolated, the practical reality was that families needed these women to continue functioning. So communities developed unofficial protocols that allowed women to remain productive while maintaining the appearance of following the contamination rules. The class differences were stark too. Noble women might retreat to their chambers during periods, which was presented as proper observance of religious law, but was really just a luxury that poor women couldn't afford. Peasant women had to figure out how to milk cows, tend children, and maintain households while supposedly being too dangerous to touch food. The contradiction between theory and practice was so obvious that everyone just agreed to pretend it made sense. Modern anthropologists studying these records have found evidence that many medieval communities were essentially running two parallel systems: the official period taboos that everyone talked about, and the practical arrangements that everyone actually followed. It's like having a speed limit that everyone ignores, except the consequences for getting caught were social ostracism rather than a traffic ticket. The result was a bizarre social ecosystem where periods became a monthly negotiation between religious law, practical necessity, and community survival. Women developed elaborate strategies for managing their cycles while minimizing social disruption, often involving networks of female cooperation that operated completely outside official channels. Some women would coordinate their work schedules around their cycles, with non-menstruating women covering tasks that menstruating women couldn't perform. This created informal support systems that were actually quite sophisticated, though they were built around the assumption that periods made women temporarily dangerous rather than just temporarily uncomfortable. The psychological impact was enormous. Medieval women lived with the constant knowledge that their bodies were considered fundamentally problematic. Unlike modern women who might feel some social awkwardness around periods, medieval women were told their monthly cycles could literally harm others. Imagine the anxiety of knowing that admitting you had cramps could result in being blamed for the neighbor's crop failure. Some women responded by becoming extremely secretive about their periods, developing coded language and hidden signals to communicate with other women about their cycles. Others became defiant, openly challenging the more ridiculous taboos, while carefully observing the ones that carried serious social consequences. The economic impact was significant too. Families with multiple daughters faced monthly disruptions to their labor force, which could affect their ability to complete time-sensitive agricultural work. Some families tried to stagger their daughters' cycles using various folk remedies, essentially trying to optimize their period schedule for maximum productivity. Village economies had to adapt to these monthly labor disruptions. Certain types of work were scheduled around the assumption that some percentage of women would be unavailable during any given week. It was like medieval period-based workforce planning, except instead of accounting for vacation time, they were accounting for supposed supernatural contamination. The religious institutions had mixed reactions. Some priests strictly enforced period taboos, while others quietly ignored them when it came to practical matters like food preparation for religious festivals. The inconsistency created confusion and anxiety among women who never knew which. Rules would be enforced when, perhaps most importantly, these beliefs shaped how medieval women understood their own bodies and their place in society. They learned to see their natural biological functions as sources of shame, danger, and social disruption. The monthly cycle became a reminder that their bodies were fundamentally different from and more problematic than men's bodies. Meanwhile, as village women were developing increasingly complex workarounds for period taboos, the religious authorities were busy creating official theological frameworks that would make these folk beliefs look reasonable by comparison. Because if you thought village superstitions about menstrual contamination were bizarre, wait until you hear what the medieval church had to say about periods. We're about to enter a world where periods weren't just socially inconvenient, they were theological problems that required input from bishops, papal declarations, and heated debates among scholars who had dedicated their lives to understanding God's will regarding women's reproductive systems. The church's approach to menstruation was like village superstition, but with more Latin and significantly higher stakes for everyone involved. If village period superstitions were like medieval folklore, then church doctrine on menstruation was like that folklore with a PhD in theology and the power to excommunicate you. The Catholic Church's approach to periods was simultaneously more sophisticated and more terrifying than village beliefs, because it came with the full weight of divine authority and centuries of scholarly debate about why God apparently hated women's reproductive systems. This theological framework developed over centuries as church scholars tried to reconcile biblical teachings, ancient medical texts, and their own observations into a coherent doctrine about menstruation. The result was a complex theological argument that essentially concluded periods were simultaneously natural because God created them, sinful because they were connected to original sin, necessary because women needed to be purified monthly, and dangerous because they could contaminate holy objects. It's like the church took every possible position on periods and then declared all of them to be simultaneously true, which required some truly impressive mental gymnastics from medieval theologians. They had to explain why God would create a biological process that was also spiritually problematic, why something natural was also sinful, and why women needed monthly purification that also made them temporarily untouchable. The church's position became important because, unlike village beliefs, which only affected local communities, church doctrine influenced law, medicine, and social policy across all of Christian Europe. When the Pope had opinions about periods, those opinions became the foundation for legal codes, medical treatments, and social customs that affected millions of women. This wasn't just abstract theological debate. These doctrines had real-world consequences for how women could participate in religious life, what jobs they could hold, and even what legal rights they possessed. The church's period policies became the framework that other institutions used to justify their own restrictions on women's activities. Consider the case of Archbishop Theodore of Canterbury in the 7th century, who wrote what was essentially the first official church policy manual on periods. Theodore's penitential included detailed instructions about how menstruating women should behave in religious contexts, and his rules were so specific they read like a medieval period etiquette guide written by someone who had clearly never experienced the period himself. According to Theodore's guidelines, menstruating women couldn't enter churches, touch holy objects, receive communion, or even hear mass from inside the building. They could listen to religious services from outside the church, which was presented as a compromise, but was really just spiritual segregation. Theodore helpfully clarified that these restrictions applied even if the woman wasn't actively bleeding. The entire menstrual period, from start to finish, rendered her spiritually dangerous. But here's where it gets really interesting. Theodore also included guidelines for what happened if a woman accidentally contaminated something holy during her period. If she touched a Bible, the book had to be ritually purified. If she entered a church, the entire building needed to be reconsecrated. If she received communion while menstruating, both she and the priest who gave it to her had to do penance. It was like spiritual hazmat protocols, except the hazardous material was a normal biological function. The most bizarre case involved a 12th century controversy over whether the Virgin Mary had periods. This wasn't just idle theological speculation. It was a serious doctrinal debate that occupied some of the brightest theological minds of the era. The problem was obvious. If periods were connected to sin and spiritual contamination, how could the sinless mother of Jesus have experienced them? Some theologians argued that Mary was exempt from menstruation due to her special status, which solved the theological problem but created a new one. If periods were natural and God created, why would God exempt Mary from something natural? Others argued that Mary did menstruate, but her periods were somehow different, pure and uncontaminated by sin, like spiritual periods that didn't count as real periods. The debate got so heated that several church councils had to address it officially. Pope Innocent III eventually declared that Mary's menstrual status was a matter of divine mystery that shouldn't be discussed by ordinary believers, which was basically the medieval equivalent of its complicated as a relationship status. One of the most dramatic examples involved Saint Bridget of Sweden in the 14th century, who claimed to receive visions directly from Jesus about menstruation. According to Bridget's accounts, Jesus told her that periods were indeed connected to original sin, but that women who endured them patiently could use the monthly suffering as a form of penance that would reduce their time in purgatory. This was actually presented as good news. Jesus was apparently offering a monthly penance program where periods counted as suffering that could be applied toward salvation. Bridget's visions suggested that women who accepted their periods as divine punishment with proper humility could actually gain spiritual benefits from their monthly contamination. It's like a medieval spiritual rewards program, except instead of earning points, you earned reduced purgatory time through menstrual cramps. The church's position created endless practical complications for religious institutions. Convents had to develop elaborate systems for managing nuns' periods while maintaining religious observances. Some convents built separate chapels where menstruating nuns could pray without contaminating the main sanctuary. Others created rotating schedules that ensured some nuns were always available for essential religious duties. The documentation from these convents reveals a fascinating parallel universe where intelligent, educated women were forced to build their entire religious lives around period management. Abbesses had to track their nun cycles, plan religious ceremonies around menstrual schedules, and developed theological justifications for allowing menstruating women to perform essential religious functions, like caring for the sick or preparing food for religious festivals. One convent in Germany developed such an elaborate system that they essentially had two parallel religious communities: the pure nuns who could perform all religious functions, and the impure nuns who were temporarily restricted. The convent records show that they tried to time important religious observances for periods when the maximum number of nuns would be available, which meant they were essentially scheduling religious life around collective menstrual cycles. The really wild part is that these same convents often house some of the most medically knowledgeable women in Europe. Nuns frequently served as healers and medical practitioners, but they had to suspend their medical practice during their own periods because they couldn't touch patients while contaminated. So the people best qualified to help with period problems were forbidden from doing so during the times when they best understood what their patients were experiencing. This wasn't isolated theological confusion. It was part of a larger pattern, where the medieval church struggled to reconcile their understanding of divine creation with their assumptions about women's inherent spiritual problems. The same logical contradictions appeared in church teachings about women's roles in general. Women were created by God, and therefore good. But they were also descended from Eve, and therefore dangerous. The pattern repeated across different aspects of women's lives. Women could be saints and mystics with direct connections to God, but they couldn't be priests because they were spiritually inferior. Women could be abbesses running major religious institutions, but they had to step down from leadership during their periods because they were temporarily contaminated. Women could have divine visions that influenced church doctrine, but they couldn't read those same doctrines aloud in church because their voices were considered spiritually inappropriate. Church's approach to periods followed this same contradictory logic. Periods were natural because God created them, but they were also punishments for sin. They were necessary for reproduction, which was blessed by God, but they also made women temporarily unfit for religious participation. They were medical conditions that required treatment, but they were also spiritual conditions that required penance. These contradictions created a theological feedback loop where each attempt to resolve the logical problems created new logical problems. The more church scholars tried to explain why God would create something that was also spiritually problematic, the more complex and contradictory their explanations became. The pattern extended to church, architecture, and religious practices. Churches developed increasingly elaborate systems for segregating menstruating women, while simultaneously requiring their participation in religious life. Some churches built separate entrances for women. Others created designated areas where menstruating women could participate in religious services without contaminating the sacred spaces. Similar patterns appeared in other Christian communities across Europe. Orthodox churches, various Protestant sects, and even heretical groups all developed their own versions of period-related restrictions that followed the same basic logic. Periods were simultaneously natural and problematic, necessary and contaminating, medical and spiritual. The consistency of these patterns suggests that the church's period policies weren't based on careful theological reasoning, but on deeper cultural assumptions about women's bodies that were then wrapped in religious language to make them seem divinely ordained. The logical contradictions were a feature, not a bug. They allowed the church to maintain that periods were both God's will and women's fault. The effects were far-reaching and permanent, shaping not just religious practice, but legal codes, medical knowledge, and social customs across medieval Europe. Church doctrine on menstruation became the foundation for secular laws that restricted women's economic activities, political participation, and legal rights. Women in medieval Europe lived under a complex system of rotating restrictions that followed their menstrual cycles. They could be full participants in society for 3 weeks out of every month, but became second-class citizens during their periods. This created a bizarre legal situation where women's rights fluctuated monthly, based on their reproductive status. The economic impact was enormous. Many professions were closed to women entirely because employers couldn't accommodate monthly periods of contamination. Others developed complex systems of substitutes and workarounds that added significant costs to employing women. The churches. Period policies essentially created a medieval gender wage gap based on theological contamination theory. The psychological effects were perhaps even more significant. Medieval women internalized the belief that their bodies were fundamentally problematic and spiritually dangerous. They learned to see their periods not as normal biological functions, but as monthly reminders of their inferior spiritual status. This created generations of women who were ashamed of their own biology and who passed that shame on to their daughters. The medical consequences were also serious, because periods were seen as spiritual problems rather than medical conditions. Women with period-related health issues often received religious treatments rather than medical care. Pain, heavy bleeding, and other symptoms were treated with prayer and penance rather than with the herbal remedies and treatments that might have actually helped. Perhaps most importantly, the Church's period policies created a precedent for using religious authority to control women's bodies and lives. The detailed regulations about when women could enter churches, touch holy objects, or participate in religious activities established a framework for religious control over women's physical existence that extended far beyond menstruation. These policies also had unexpected consequences for women's community building. The shared experience of monthly spiritual exile created networks of female solidarity and mutual support that operated outside official church channels. Women developed their own informal religious practices, shared knowledge about managing periods, and created support systems that helped them navigate the complex restrictions they faced. The Church's approach to periods also influenced medical knowledge by reinforcing the idea that women's bodies were fundamentally different from and more problematic than men's bodies. This contributed to the development of medical theories that saw women as defective men rather than as different, but equally valid human beings. Yet even as church, authorities were debating the theological implications of periods and creating elaborate doctrines about menstrual contamination. The practical reality of medieval life was forcing people to develop actual solutions for managing periods on a daily basis. Because while bishops could write treatises about the spiritual dangers of menstruation, medieval women still needed to figure out how to handle their periods with the materials and knowledge available to them. We're about to enter the world of medieval period technology, and I use that term very loosely. We're talking about a time when the height of feminine hygiene innovation was clean rags, if you're lucky, and when period pain management involved remedies that were often more dangerous than the cramps themselves. The gap between theological theory and practical reality was about to become very, very obvious, and the solutions medieval women developed were equal parts ingenious and terrifying. By the 13th century, the contradiction between period theory and period reality had reached a breaking point. You had church authorities writing detailed theological treatises about menstrual contamination, village communities developing elaborate avoidance rituals, and medical authorities debating the spiritual implications of periods. But absolutely, nobody was addressing the basic practical question of how women were supposed to actually manage their periods with the technology available in medieval Europe. This wasn't just an academic problem. Medieval women were trying to maintain their daily lives while using period management techniques that would make a modern camping trip look luxurious. They had to work, care for families, and fulfill social obligations while dealing with periods. Using materials that were basically whatever fabric you can spare if any. The crisis was particularly acute because medieval society had created this elaborate superstructure of period-related rules and restrictions without developing any corresponding infrastructure to help women actually follow those rules. It's like creating detailed traffic laws without building roads. Theoretically impressive, but practically useless. The stakes were incredibly high. Poor period management could lead to infections, social ostracism, or accusations of moral corruption. But the available solutions were so primitive that successful period management was largely a matter of luck, resourcefulness, and having access to clean water, which many medieval women didn't. The tension between what society expected of menstruating women and what was actually possible with medieval technology created a crisis that affected millions of women across Europe. They were supposed to remain clean, discreet, and spiritually pure while using period management, techniques that medieval people wouldn't have considered adequate for cleaning up after livestock. The perfect example of this crisis in action comes from the detailed household accounts of Eleanor de Montfort, a 13th century English noblewoman whose steward kept meticulous records of household expenses. These records give us an unusually detailed look at how even wealthy medieval women dealt with periods. And the picture is both fascinating and horrifying. Eleanor's household accounts show regular purchases of linen specifically designated for women's necessities, which was the polite medieval term for period supplies. But here's the kicker. Even for a wealthy countess, the amount of linen purchased was shockingly small. Eleanor's steward bought enough linen for period use to supply the entire female household staff for about 3 days per month. That's it. 3 days of clean linen for periods that lasted a week. The accounts reveal what happened to the used linen. It was washed, dried, and reused repeatedly until it literally fell apart. The same pieces of cloth were being used for periods, then washed in cold water, because hot water was expensive, then used again. We're talking about fabric that was being recycled for period use until it was essentially held together by hope. And medieval detergent, which was mostly just ash and urine. But the real drama starts when we look at what happened during Eleanor's own periods. The household accounts show that during certain weeks, Eleanor's personal expenses spiked dramatically. She bought extra wine for pain management. Additional fires were lit in her chambers because medieval period advice included staying warm. And her food purchases changed to include specific items that were supposed to help with period pain. 1 month's accounts are particularly revealing. Eleanor apparently had such severe period pain that she sent for a physician from London, which was expensive and time-consuming. The physician's recommended treatment was bloodletting, removing blood to treat a condition caused by losing blood. It's like treating dehydration with diuretics, except somehow even less logical. The physician also prescribed a mixture of herbs, including pennyroyal, which is toxic in large doses, and ergot, which can cause hallucinations and gangrene. Eleanor paid the equivalent of several months' wages for a treatment that could have killed her, all because medieval medicine had decided that periods were best treated by making women even sicker. The accounts show that Eleanor tried this treatment exactly once, then never called that physician again. Instead, she started paying regular fees to a local wise woman who provided different herbal remedies. The wise woman's treatments included willow bark, which actually contains a compound similar to aspirin, warm baths with specific herbs, and dietary recommendations that were actually sensible. The contrast is striking. The expensive, university-trained physician nearly poisoned Eleanor with his period treatments, while the village wise woman provided remedies that were actually helpful. It's like paying premium prices for medical advice that's worse than what you could get from your grandmother. Except your grandmother hadn't spent years studying ancient Greek text about wandering uteri. But the most dramatic entry in Eleanor's accounts involves a period-related emergency during a royal visit. Eleanor was hosting the Queen and her court when she got her period unexpectedly. The household accounts show frantic purchases of expensive imported linen, emergency payments to extra laundresses, and the costs of housing Eleanor's female attendants in a separate building so they could help manage the situation without contaminating the royal visitors. The accounts reveal that Eleanor had to maintain the fiction of being available to entertain the Queen while actually being quarantined in her chambers. Her steward paid servants to carry messages back and forth, hired musicians to play outside Eleanor's windows, so it would seem like she was participating in the festivities, and even arranged for her meals to be prepared separately so she wouldn't contaminate the royal food. The whole charade cost more than most peasant families earned in a year, and it still didn't work perfectly. One account entry mentions paying extra wages to servants who had to clean up after what was diplomatically described as an accident in the Great Hall. Eleanor apparently leaked through her period protection during a formal dinner with the Queen, which was both a medical emergency and a social catastrophe. The aftermath involved more expense, new rushes for the floor, extra cleaning for the furniture, and what appears to have been bribes to ensure that none of the servants would gossip about the incident. The account suggests that Eleanor spent the equivalent of buying a small house just to cover up one period-related accident during a royal visit. The final twist is that despite all this expense and drama, Eleanor got pregnant 3 months later, which suggests that her period problems weren't actually medical conditions that needed treatment. They were just normal period experiences that medieval society had no reasonable way to handle. The accounts end with a somewhat bitter note from Eleanor's steward about the monthly affliction that brings disorder to well-ordered households. Even the people managing medieval period logistics were frustrated with how completely inadequate the available solutions were. The response to Eleanor's period crisis rippled through the social networks of 13th century English nobility and revealed just how widespread these problems were. Other noble households began keeping more detailed records of period-related expenses, partly to learn from Eleanor's solutions and partly to prepare for their own period emergencies. The immediate consequence was that wealthy families started building separate facilities specifically for managing periods. These weren't the peaceful retreat huts that modern people might imagine. They were essentially medieval period bunkers designed to contain contamination while maintaining social appearances. Some noble houses built what they euphemistically called women's chambers that were really just isolation units with better decorations. The costs spiraled quickly. Families were spending enormous amounts of money on period management, from the materials themselves to the secondary costs of maintaining social fictions about women's availability during their periods. The English court accounts from this period show that period-related expenses were a significant budget item for any household that included women. The social consequences were equally dramatic. Eleanor's royal period incident became court gossip, which led to new protocols for managing periods during formal social events. Court ladies developed elaborate systems of backup plans, substitute attendees, and emergency evacuation procedures for period-related crises. These new protocols created a parallel social infrastructure that existed entirely to manage the gap between period reality and social expectations. Wealthy women formed networks that functioned like medieval period insurance. They would cover for each other during period emergencies, provide backup supplies, and maintain social appearances. When someone was dealing with period problems, the religious reactions were predictably complex. Some church authorities pointed to Eleanor's difficulties as evidence that periods were indeed divine punishment that couldn't be avoided through wealth or status. Others argued that her problems proved that even noble women needed better spiritual preparation for their monthly purification. The medical community's response was to double down on treatments that clearly weren't working. physicians began prescribing even more elaborate and dangerous period remedies, apparently on the theory that if simple bloodletting didn't work, the solution was more complex bloodletting combined with toxic herbs and dietary restrictions. Perhaps, most importantly, Eleanor's experience revealed that even the wealthiest, most privileged women in medieval society were struggling with basic period management. If a countess with unlimited resources was having period emergencies and social catastrophes, what were ordinary women dealing with? The documentation of Eleanor's period problems also influenced how other noble families planned their social calendars. Households began tracking the cycles of their female family members to avoid scheduling important events during times when period problems might disrupt the proceedings. It was like medieval period-based event planning, except the stakes were social reputation rather than just convenience. The legal consequences were subtle but significant. Eleanor's period incident during a royal visit raised questions about whether period-related social failures could be considered breaches of feudal obligations. If a noble woman couldn't fulfill her hosting duties due to period problems, was that a legitimate excuse or a failure of proper planning? These questions influenced inheritance law, marriage contracts, and social obligations for generations. Medieval legal documents began including language that subtly acknowledged period-related limitations on women's social availability, while maintaining the fiction that periods didn't really affect women's ability to fulfill their social roles. This period crisis wasn't just about Eleanor's personal struggles. It revealed the fundamental contradiction at the heart of medieval society's approach to women's bodies. Medieval culture had created elaborate social, religious, and legal frameworks that assumed women could function normally despite having monthly experiences that the same culture considered physically debilitating, spiritually contaminating, and socially disruptive. The Eleanor incident showed that even unlimited resources couldn't solve the basic problem. Medieval society had designed social systems that were incompatible with biological reality. No amount of money, servants, or planning could bridge the gap between what periods actually involved and what medieval society pretended they involved. This contradiction had broader implications for how medieval society understood women's capabilities and reliability. If even the wealthiest, most privileged women were having period-related crises, how could society trust women with important responsibilities? The logical conclusion was that women were inherently unreliable, which justified excluding them from positions of authority and independence. The period management crisis also revealed the economic costs of medieval gender roles. Families were spending enormous resources on managing something that was simultaneously considered natural and problematic, necessary and contaminating. The money spent on period management could have been used for other purposes, but medieval society had decided that containing menstrual contamination was more important than economic efficiency. Perhaps most significantly, the Eleanor incident and others like it demonstrated that medieval period problems weren't actually medical problems. They were social problems created by inadequate technology and ridiculous cultural expectations. The same period experiences that caused social catastrophes in medieval Europe were perfectly manageable with better materials and less absurd social rules. The broader implication was that medieval society had created its own period problems. Through a combination of technological inadequacy and cultural irrationality, the suffering that medieval women experienced during their periods wasn't inevitable. It was the predictable result of a society that had chosen to treat normal biological functions as supernatural emergencies, requiring elaborate containment. Protocols dot around the main drama of medieval period management. A fascinating cast of supporting characters played crucial roles in shaping how periods were understood and handled. These weren't the famous abbesses or noble ladies whose stories dominated official records. These were the people who actually had to deal with the day-to-day reality of periods in medieval society. First, meet Marguerite the Bloodletter, a 14th century French woman who made her living providing medical services to other women. Marguerite wasn't a trained physician. She was what we'd now call a nurse practitioner, except her medical training consisted entirely of whatever she'd learned from other women and her own experimentation. She specialized in period-related treatments, which put her in the bizarre position of being simultaneously essential and socially suspect. Marguerite's services included bloodletting for period pain, because medieval medicine believed that removing blood would somehow help with problems caused by losing blood, herbal treatments for irregular cycles, and what she called purification rituals that were basically medieval period prep. Her client records, preserved in a French monastery, show that she treated everyone from peasant women to minor nobility, all while navigating the complex social rules about who could touch whom during periods. The fascinating part is that Marguerite had to develop her own period management system while providing care to others. Her records show that she scheduled her treatments around her own cycle, charging different rates depending on whether she was considered clean or contaminated. When providing services, she essentially created a sliding fee scale based on her own menstrual status, which is probably the most medieval business model imaginable. Then there's Brother Albertus, a German monk who became accidentally famous for writing what was essentially the medieval equivalent of a period fac. Albertus wasn't a medical expert. He was a monastery librarian who got tired of answering the same questions about periods from confused monks who had to deal with female servants, visitors, and relatives. His questions concerning women's monthly afflictions became one of the most widely copied texts of the 14th century. Brother Albertus addressed practical questions like, "Can a menstruating woman milk cows?" His answer, "Only if absolutely necessary, and only while wearing blessed gloves. Should menstruating women be allowed in monasteries?" His answer, "Only in the outer courtyards, and only during emergencies." And, "What happens if a woman gets her period while on pilgrimage?" His answer, "She should find the nearest convent and wait it out." What makes Albertus hilarious is that his expertise was purely theoretical. He never actually experienced a period, or even talked to a woman about periods. His advice was based entirely on reading other monks' writings about periods, which were based on reading ancient Greek texts about periods, which were based on the assumptions of men who also had never experienced periods. It was like a centuries-long game of period telephone played exclusively by celibate men. Perhaps most importantly, there was Goody Agnes, a village wise woman in England whose period remedies were so effective that women traveled for miles to consult her. Agnes represented the unofficial medical system that actually worked, as opposed to the official medical system that was trying to cure periods with bloodletting and toxic herbs. Agnes had developed a comprehensive approach to period management that included pain relief, using willow bark and other herbs that actually contained effective compounds, cycle regulation through dietary changes that modern research suggests might have worked, and practical advice about hygiene and period materials. Her treatments were based on decades of trial and error, patient feedback, and the accumulated wisdom of generations of women. The contradiction was that Agnes provided the most effective period care available in medieval Europe, but she had to do it secretly because her methods contradicted official medical doctrine. Women would visit her under the pretense of getting other treatments, then receive period advice as part of a broader consultation. She essentially ran an underground period clinic disguised as general healthcare. Agnes also had to navigate the social implications of her expertise. She was valuable enough that local authorities tolerated her practices, but suspect enough that she couldn't advertise her period specialization. Her reputation spread through word-of-mouth networks among women, creating an informal referral system that operated completely outside official medical channels. The irony is that these three characters, the entrepreneurial bloodletter, the clueless monk, and the effective wise woman, represented the three competing approaches to period management in medieval society. Expensive treatments that didn't work, official doctrine that ignored reality, and practical solutions that had to operate in secret. These weren't isolated incidents. The stories of medieval period management were connected through complex networks of relationships, trade routes, and social hierarchies that created a hidden economy of women's health knowledge. The connections between these different approaches to periods reveal how medieval society actually functioned beneath the surface of official doctrine. Marguerite the Bloodletter, for example, didn't work in isolation. She was part of a network of women who provided medical services that operated like a medieval healthcare system, except it was run entirely by women with no official training or recognition. These women referred patients to each other, shared information about effective treatments, and developed specializations based on their experience and local resources. The records show that Marguerite regularly sent patients to other women who specialized in different aspects of women's health. Women with severe period pain might be referred to herbalists who focused on pain management, while women with irregular cycles might be sent to specialists who dealt with fertility issues. It was like having a women's health network that operated through informal referrals and word-of-mouth recommendations. This network extended across national boundaries and social classes. A merchant's wife in France might use remedies that originated with a peasant woman in Germany, transmitted through a chain of women who had adapted and improved the treatments over generations. The connections were maintained through trade routes, pilgrimage paths, and the movement of women between households through marriage and employment. Brother Albertus's theological advice, meanwhile, was influencing practical policy across Europe through the monastery network. His period fac was being copied and distributed to monasteries, convents, and church authorities throughout the continent. Local priests were using his guidelines to make decisions about everything from whether women could enter churches during their periods to how period-related religious violations should be handled. But here's where it gets interesting. The practical implementation of Albertus's advice was being filtered through the networks of women who actually had to live with these rules. Religious authorities might decree that menstruating women couldn't touch holy objects, but the actual enforcement depended on women who had their own ideas about how strictly these rules should be followed. The result was a fascinating tension between official policy and practical implementation. A convent might officially follow Albertus's guidelines about period restrictions, while the nuns quietly developed workarounds that allowed them to continue their essential duties during their periods. The same rules were being interpreted differently in different places, depending on the local balance between religious authority and practical necessity. Goody Anna's underground period clinic was connected to this broader network through women who sought her help and then shared her remedies with others. Her treatment spread through the same informal networks that distributed other forms of women's knowledge, from childcare advice to household management techniques. The really fascinating connections emerged when these different systems intersected. Women might receive official religious guidance about periods from authorities influenced by Brother Albertus, get medical treatment from practitioners like Marguerite, and then seek additional help from wise women like Agnes. They were essentially navigating three different healthcare systems simultaneously, each with its own assumptions, methods, and limitations. These intersections created opportunities for knowledge exchange that influenced all three systems. Marguerite might adopt herbal remedies that originated with village-wise women, while religious authorities might adjust their policies based on feedback about their practical consequences. Agnes might incorporate elements from official medical treatments that proved effective, while discarding the parts that didn't work. The trade routes that connected medieval Europe also served as conduits for period-related knowledge. Merchants' wives, pilgrims, and other traveling women carried information about effective period remedies from place to place, creating an informal system for distributing women's health knowledge that operated completely outside official medical channels. Perhaps most importantly, these networks created a form of quality control for period treatments. Remedies that worked were passed along and improved, while treatments that didn't work were gradually abandoned. It was like a medieval version of peer review, except it was conducted by the people who actually had to live with the consequences of the treatments. The connections between these different approaches to period management revealed that medieval society was more complex and adaptive than official records suggest. While authorities were debating theological implications and medical theories, women were creating practical solutions that drew from multiple sources and evolved based on real-world experience. To understand medieval period management, you have to understand that it existed within a cultural framework that was simultaneously obsessed with purity and completely filthy by modern standards. Medieval people lived in a world where they rarely bathed, where human waste was a constant presence in daily life, and where basic hygiene was a luxury that most people couldn't afford. Yet these same people had developed elaborate theories about how periods could contaminate bread, sour wine, and kill plants. Daily life in medieval Europe was, to put it bluntly, gross. Most people owned only one set of clothes, which they wore continuously until the fabric literally fell apart. They shared beds with family members, farm animals, and various parasites. They disposed of human waste by throwing it out windows, onto streets that were already ankle-deep in mud, garbage, and animal droppings. In this context, the obsession with menstrual contamination becomes even more bizarre. People who lived surrounded by actual filth were terrified of theoretical contamination from periods. They would handle animal blood, human excrement, and rotting food as part of their daily routine, but they believed that menstrual blood could magically ruin food just by proximity. The social structures that governed medieval life were based on rigid hierarchies that determined everything from what you could wear to where you could sit in church. But periods created a strange exception to these hierarchies. During their periods, noble women and peasant women were subject to the same contamination taboos. A countess having her period was just as spiritually dangerous as a peasant girl, which was one of the few aspects of medieval life that was genuinely democratic. Medieval people believed in a world that was filled with supernatural forces, magical influences, and divine interventions. They thought that blessed objects could cure diseases, that certain prayers could control the weather, and that saints could intervene in daily life. In this worldview, the idea that periods could have magical contaminating properties wasn't particularly strange. It fit with their general belief that everything had supernatural implications. What was considered normal versus exceptional is particularly revealing. Medieval people thought it was normal for children to die regularly, for most people to be malnourished, and for basic medical care to be unavailable. But they thought it was exceptional and requiring divine explanation that women had monthly periods. They accepted mass death from preventable diseases as part of God's plan, but they needed elaborate theological frameworks to explain menstruation. The family structures of medieval society were designed around economic survival rather than emotional support. Children were economic assets, marriages were business arrangements, and family relationships were governed by practical considerations about resources and labor. But period management required forms of emotional and practical support that these economic family structures weren't designed to provide. Perhaps most ironic was the fact that medieval society's approach to periods created most of the problems they were trying to solve. The elaborate contamination taboos and social restrictions made period management much more difficult, while the medical treatments based on theological assumptions often made period symptoms worse rather than better. The contradiction between theory and practice was everywhere. Official doctrine said that menstruating women were too spiritually dangerous to enter churches, but many churches relied on women's labor for essential functions, like preparing communion bread and maintaining altar linens. The same women who were supposedly too contaminated to touch holy objects were the ones responsible for keeping religious institutions running. Medieval medicine claimed to be based on ancient Greek wisdom and divine revelation, but the most effective period treatments came from village-wise women who were considered medically ignorant. University-trained physicians prescribed treatments that could kill their patients, while uneducated women developed remedies that actually worked. The official medical system was less effective than the unofficial one, but it carried more social authority. The economic contradictions were equally obvious. Families spent enormous resources on managing periods through elaborate containment protocols, while the same families often couldn't afford basic necessities like adequate food or clean water. Society was willing to invest heavily in managing the theoretical dangers of periods while ignoring the practical problems that actually affected people's health and survival. Perhaps most contradictory was the fact that medieval society simultaneously treated periods as both completely natural because God created them, and completely unnatural because they required supernatural explanations and magical containment. Periods were divine punishment, natural biology, spiritual contamination, and medical conditions all at the same time, depending on what arguments someone needed to make. Modern parallels to these contradictions are everywhere. Contemporary societies still struggle with balancing practical period needs against cultural taboos, still debate whether periods are medical issues or natural processes, and still create social systems that make period management more difficult than it needs to be. The medieval approach to periods was more extreme than modern attitudes, but the basic contradictions remain remarkably consistent across centuries. Everything changed when the Black Death arrived in Europe in 1347, though not in the way you might expect. The plague didn't directly affect period management, but it created a massive social upheaval that completely disrupted the elaborate systems medieval society had built around menstrual taboos. When a third of Europe's population died in 5 years, suddenly worrying about whether periods could contaminate bread seemed like a luxury that society could no longer afford. The demographic crisis created by the plague meant that every surviving person became economically valuable in ways that hadn't been true before. Peasant women who had previously been restricted from certain types of work during their periods were suddenly needed to fill essential jobs regardless of their menstrual status. The elaborate social protocols that had kept menstruating women isolated became impossible to maintain when communities were struggling to survive with drastically reduced populations. The religious response to the plague also changed how periods were understood theologically. When God was apparently sending deadly disease to kill entire communities, the monthly contamination of periods seemed relatively minor by comparison. Church authorities who had previously spent considerable time debating the spiritual implications of menstruation were suddenly focused on much more pressing theological questions about mass death and divine punishment. More practically, the plague disrupted the networks of women's knowledge that had developed around period management. Many of the wise women, village healers, and informal medical practitioners who had provided period care died in the plague, taking their knowledge with them. The surviving women had to rebuild these support systems from scratch, often with incomplete information and fewer resources. The economic changes that followed the plague were equally significant. Labor shortages meant that women's work became more valuable, and employers couldn't afford to lose female workers for a quarter of every month due to period-related restrictions. The practical pressure to keep women working during their periods gradually eroded many of the elaborate taboos that had previously governed menstrual behavior. The shift wasn't sudden or universal. Different communities adapted to post-plague realities in different ways, and some areas maintained traditional period restrictions longer than others. But the overall trend was clear. The social and economic disruption caused by the plague made many medieval period taboos impractical to maintain. Perhaps most importantly, the plague created a generation of women who had lived through genuine crisis and who had practical experience managing essential tasks under extreme conditions. These women were less likely to accept arbitrary restrictions on their activities and more likely to prioritize practical effectiveness over theoretical contamination concerns. The transformation of medieval period management didn't happen overnight. It unfolded through decades of gradual adaptation, resistance, and negotiation as communities tried to balance traditional beliefs with post-plague realities. The process reveals how social change actually works at the ground level, especially when it involves deeply embedded cultural beliefs about women's bodies. Initially, many communities tried to maintain their traditional period restrictions while adapting to post-plague labor shortages. Some villages developed elaborate workarounds that technically preserved the contamination taboos, while allowing women to remain productive during their periods. Women might be required to use special tools, wear protective clothing, or work through intermediaries, but they were allowed to continue essential work that would have been forbidden before the plague. These compromises created increasingly complex and sometimes ridiculous situations. In some areas, menstruating women were allowed to milk cows but not churn butter, or to harvest grain but not grind flour, or to prepare food for their own families but not for religious festivals. The distinctions became so elaborate that communities needed specialists just to interpret the rules about what menstruating women could and couldn't do. The resistance to change came primarily from religious authorities and older community members, who saw the relaxation of period taboos as evidence of moral decline. Some church leaders argued that the plague had been sent as punishment for previous violations of divine law, and that loosening restrictions on menstruating women would invite further divine wrath. This created tension between practical necessity and religious orthodoxy that played out differently in different communities. Some of the most interesting resistance came from women themselves, particularly older women who had spent decades navigating the traditional system and who were reluctant to abandon beliefs that had shaped their entire understanding of their own bodies. These women sometimes became the strongest defenders of period restrictions, arguing that younger women who ignored the taboos were inviting spiritual and practical disasters. The champions of change were typically younger women who had come of age during or after the plague, and who had practical experience with the economic and social flexibility that crisis conditions had required. These women had seen that period restrictions were not divinely mandated natural laws, but social conventions that could be modified when circumstances required it. The breakthrough moments often came during specific crises when communities had to choose between maintaining period taboos and meeting essential survival needs. A village might maintain traditional restrictions until a harvest crisis required every available worker, or a monastery might preserve period-related rules until an epidemic left them short-staffed during a critical period. These crisis situations created precedents that were difficult to reverse once the immediate emergency had passed. If a community had successfully operated with menstruating women doing forbidden work during a crisis, it became harder to argue that such work was inherently dangerous or spiritually contaminating. The practical evidence contradicted the theoretical beliefs. The role of individual women versus larger historical forces is particularly interesting. While the plague created the conditions that made change possible, the actual transformation required countless individual women to make daily decisions about whether to follow traditional restrictions or prioritize practical needs. Change happened because individual women chose practical effectiveness over social conformity, one decision at a time. The process was also influenced by generational change. As women who had lived through the plague became community elders, they brought different assumptions about the relationship between period restrictions and social survival. Instead of asking, "What do the traditional rules say?" they were more likely to ask, "What works in practice?" The geographical variations in how change unfolded reveal how local conditions influence the pace and extent of transformation. Urban areas which had suffered higher plague mortality and experienced more dramatic social disruption generally adapted more quickly than rural areas. Communities with strong religious institutions maintained traditional practices longer than communities where secular authorities dominated. Trade routes and communication networks also affected how new approaches to period management spread between communities. Merchants, pilgrims, and other travelers carried information about how different places were handling the tension between traditional beliefs and practical needs, creating an informal system for sharing innovation and adaptation strategies. Perhaps most importantly, the process of change revealed that many medieval period restrictions had been maintained through social habit rather than genuine conviction. When external pressure forced communities to examine their practices, many people discovered that they had been following elaborate rules without really understanding why those rules existed or whether they served any useful purpose. The transformation also created new forms of knowledge and expertise. Women who had successfully navigated the transition from traditional to adapted period management became informal consultants for other communities facing similar challenges. A new generation of practical experts emerged who understood both the traditional system and the possibilities for modification. The new post-plague reality of period management was dramatically different from the elaborate medieval system that had developed over previous centuries. By the early 5th century, most European communities had settled into approaches that prioritized practical functionality over theoretical contamination, though the transition was neither complete nor uniform across different regions and social classes. The most obvious change was in work patterns. Women were now expected to continue most of their essential labor during their periods, with accommodations made for particularly demanding or dangerous tasks rather than blanket restrictions on all work. The elaborate systems of monthly isolation and substitute workers largely disappeared, replaced by more flexible arrangements that recognize periods as temporary inconveniences rather than spiritual emergencies. Religious observances were modified in ways that would have been unthinkable in the 13th century. Many churches quietly stopped enforcing strict period-related restrictions on church attendance, while maintaining the theoretical position that such restrictions were still spiritually appropriate. The result was a practical compromise where women could participate in most religious activities during their periods, but were expected to be discreet about it. The medical approach to periods also evolved significantly. The post-plague medical system, such as it was, focused more on practical symptom management and less on theological explanations for period-related conditions. Village healers and wise women gained more social recognition for their practical expertise, while university-trained physicians were increasingly seen as expensive and ineffective for women's health issues. Period materials and hygiene practices improved dramatically, partly due to increased availability of linen and other fabrics as plague mortality had left more resources available for the survivors. Women have better access to clean materials and more opportunities to maintain period hygiene without violating social taboos about cleanliness and contamination. The social dynamics around periods changed in subtle but important ways. The shared experience of crisis had created more solidarity among women and more recognition that period restrictions were social conveniences rather than natural laws. Women were more likely to support each other in bending or ignoring period-related rules when practical considerations required it. However, the new reality wasn't uniformly progressive. Some communities responded to social disruption by becoming more rigid about the period restrictions they chose to maintain, using menstrual taboos as symbols of social stability and moral order. In these places, period management became even more restrictive than it had been before the plague, as communities tried to restore a sense of divine favor through stricter observance of traditional rules. The class differences in period management became more pronounced rather than less. Wealthy families, who had more resources to maintain elaborate period protocols, sometimes used strict observance of traditional restrictions as a way to demonstrate their social status and moral superiority. Poor families, who needed every family member's labor, were more likely to adopt flexible approaches that prioritized economic survival. Legal and institutional changes reflected these new realities in complex ways. Some legal codes were modified to acknowledge that period-related restrictions might need to be waived during emergencies or labor shortages. Other legal systems became more explicit about maintaining traditional restrictions, apparently in response to concerns that social change was undermining moral order. Perhaps most importantly, the new reality included recognition that period management systems could be changed when they no longer served practical purposes. This was a fundamental shift from the medieval assumption that period restrictions were divinely ordained natural laws that couldn't be modified. The post-plague generation had learned that social rules about periods were human creations that could be adapted to meet human needs. Was this change positive or negative? The answer depends entirely on your perspective, and medieval people themselves were deeply divided about whether the transformation of period management represented social progress or moral decline. From a practical standpoint, the changes were overwhelmingly positive. Women had more freedom to work, participate in social activities, and maintain their daily routines during their periods. The elaborate and expensive systems of monthly isolation were replaced with more flexible arrangements that recognize periods as normal biological functions rather than spiritual emergencies. Period-related healthcare improved as communities focused more on practical symptom management and less on theological explanations. The economic benefits were significant for both individuals and communities. Families no longer lost a quarter of their female labor force every month due to period restrictions. Communities could maintain essential services without elaborate backup systems to accommodate menstrual taboos. The resources previously spent on managing theoretical contamination could be redirected toward addressing actual health and social needs. From a social perspective, the changes created more solidarity among women and reduced the shame and isolation associated with periods. The shared experience of adapting traditional practices to post-plague realities had taught women that period restrictions were social conventions rather than natural laws, which was psychologically liberating for many. However, many contemporary observers saw these changes as evidence of moral and spiritual decline. Religious authorities argued that relaxing period restrictions would invite divine punishment similar to the plague itself. Traditional community leaders worried that abandoning established customs would lead to broader social chaos and moral confusion. The unintended consequences were complex and sometimes problematic. In some communities, the reduction of period-specific restrictions was accompanied by new forms of control over women's behavior. Without the monthly rhythm of restriction and freedom, some authorities developed more constant forms of oversight over women's activities. Modern judgment tends to view the post-plague changes as clearly progressive, representing movement toward more rational and humane approaches to period management. Contemporary views were much more mixed, with many people genuinely believing that the traditional restrictions served important spiritual and social purposes that shouldn't be abandoned for mere practical convenience. The long-term effects suggest that the changes were generally beneficial, contributing to gradual improvements in women's social status and health care that continued over subsequent centuries. But the immediate experience was often confusing and anxiety-provoking for people who had to navigate the transition between old and new systems of understanding periods. In the decades and centuries that followed the post-plague transformation, period management continued to evolve in ways that reflected broader changes in European society, technology, and religious thought. The 15th and 16th centuries saw the development of what historians now call practical period pragmatism approaches to menstrual management to balance traditional beliefs with economic and social realities. The most significant development was the emergence of regional variations in period management that reflected local economic conditions, religious influences, and cultural traditions. Areas that had been heavily affected by the plague developed more flexible approaches that prioritized practical functionality, while areas that had been less disrupted often maintained more traditional restrictions well into the Renaissance. Urban centers, particularly trading cities, became laboratories for new approaches to period management as women from different cultural backgrounds shared knowledge and practices. The wives of merchants, craftsmen, and other urban workers needed period management strategies that were compatible with regular work schedules and commercial activities, leading to innovations that wouldn't have been necessary in agricultural communities. The printing press, introduced in the mid-15th century, had an unexpected impact on period knowledge by making it possible to distribute information about women's health more widely than ever before. However, most of the printed medical texts were still written by male physicians and reflected traditional theoretical approaches rather than the practical innovations that women had developed through experience. The Protestant Reformation in the 16th century created new theological debates about periods that sometimes contradicted the pragmatic accommodations that communities had developed. Some Protestant reformers argued for stricter observance of biblical period restrictions, while others rejected Catholic period taboos as unscriptural superstitions. The result was increased religious confusion about periods, just as practical approaches were becoming more standardized. Second-generation effects of the post-plague changes included the development of new forms of women's medical knowledge that combined traditional herbal remedies with practical experience gained during the social disruptions of the 14th and 15th centuries. This knowledge was passed down through networks of women that operated parallel to official medical institutions, creating an informal but sophisticated system of women's health care. The economic integration of women's labor that had begun during the plague period continued to develop, leading to gradual changes in marriage customs, inheritance laws, and family structures. Women who were expected to work during their periods were also more likely to have economic independence and social autonomy in other areas of their lives. New challenges emerged as well. The increased expectations for women's productivity during their periods created pressure to minimize or ignore period-related health problems that might require rest or medical attention. Some women found that the new flexibility came with new demands that were equally constraining in different ways. The relationship between period management and social class became more complex as urban middle classes developed their own approaches that were distinct from both noble traditions and peasant practices. Merchant families, professional households, and other emerging social groups created period management systems that reflected their specific economic needs and social aspirations. The transformation of medieval period management brought new types of people into positions of influence and expertise, fundamentally changing who had authority over women's reproductive health and how that authority was exercised. Professional midwives emerged as a new class of medical practitioners who specialized in women's health issues, including period management. Unlike the village-wise women who had previously provided informal care, these midwives often had formal training, official recognition from medical guilds, and legal authority to practice medicine. They developed standardized approaches to period care that combined traditional remedies with new techniques, learned through professional networks. The midwives' approach differed significantly from earlier practitioners because they had to balance women's practical needs with professional credibility in male-dominated medical institutions. This led to more systematic documentation of period treatments, better quality control for remedies, and increased standardization of care practices. However, it also meant that women's health care became more expensive and less accessible to poor women who couldn't afford professional services. Guild-trained physicians began to take more interest in women's health as the economic value of women's labor became more apparent. However, their approach was often at odds with the practical innovations that women had developed through experience. These physicians brought theoretical knowledge from medical texts, but lacked practical understanding of how periods affected women's daily lives and work capabilities. A particularly influential new player was the emergence of what we might call period entrepreneurs, women who built businesses around providing period-related services and supplies. These included women who specialized in producing and selling period materials, others who provided laundering services specifically for menstrual items, and some who offered consulting services to help families develop period management strategies. One notable example was Dame Margaret Whitmore, a 15th century English woman who created what was essentially the first commercial period supply business. She employed a network of women who produced standardized linen period materials, developed washing and sterilization protocols, and provided delivery services to customers who wanted to maintain privacy about their period supply purchases. Her business model was so successful that it was copied in other cities across England and continental Europe. These period entrepreneurs were important because they created the first market-based solutions to period management, replacing the family-based and community-based systems that had previously dominated. Women could now purchase professional period management services rather than relying entirely on their own knowledge and resources or the informal support of other women. Religious reformers, both Catholic and Protestant, became new voices in period management debates as they tried to align period practices with their theological positions. Some reformers argued for returning to stricter biblical restrictions, while others advocated for eliminating period taboos entirely as unscriptural traditions. Their influence varied by region and religious community, but they added new layers of complexity to period management decisions. Urban authorities and guild leaders also became new players as they developed regulations for businesses that employed women, trades that involved food handling, and other activities where period restrictions had traditionally applied. These authorities often had to balance traditional beliefs about contamination with practical economic needs, leading to compromise policies that satisfied neither traditionalists nor reformers. Perhaps most importantly, a new generation of women emerged who had grown up with more flexible period management systems and who brought different expectations about women's capabilities and social roles. These women were more likely to challenge remaining period restrictions, more willing to discuss period issues openly, and more interested in developing further improvements in period care and management. The interactions between these new players created a more complex and dynamic system of period management that was less uniform than the medieval system, but more responsive to women's actual needs and experiences. But some problems persisted, and in many cases, the transformation of medieval period management solved old problems while creating entirely new ones. The fundamental tension between cultural beliefs about periods and practical reality remained, even as the specific manifestations of that tension evolved. One of the most persistent issues was the continued lack of accurate medical knowledge about periods. While practical management had improved significantly, the underlying understanding of menstruation remained based on ancient theories about humors, contamination, and divine punishment. This meant that women with serious period-related health problems still received treatments that were ineffective or actively harmful. The availability of period materials remained a significant problem for many women, particularly in rural areas and among the urban poor. While some regions had developed commercial period supply businesses, these services were expensive and often unreliable. Many women still relied on improvised materials and inadequate hygiene practices that could lead to infections and other health complications. New versions of old problems emerged as period management became more commercialized. Instead of family-based or community-based period support systems, women increasingly had to purchase period care in market-based transactions. This created new forms of inequality based on economic access to period supplies and services, while eliminating some of the informal support networks that had previously helped women manage their periods. The religious and legal confusion about periods actually increased in some areas as different authorities promoted conflicting approaches. Women might receive different advice about period restrictions from Catholic and Protestant clergy, from traditional midwives and guild-trained physicians, or from local customs and urban regulations. The result was often more anxiety and confusion, rather than clearer guidance. Cyclical patterns of reaction and reform meant that progress in period management was often temporary or incomplete. Communities that had developed flexible approaches during crisis periods sometimes reverted to stricter restrictions when conditions stabilized. Religious revivals often included attempts to restore traditional period taboos, while economic downturns might force families to abandon commercial period services and return to more primitive management methods. Why certain issues proved intractable becomes clearer when we examine the underlying assumptions that remained unchanged despite practical adaptations. Most Europeans still believed that periods were connected to sin, contamination, and spiritual impurity, even if they had modified their practical responses to these beliefs. The fundamental worldview that saw women's bodies as problematic remained intact, limiting the extent of possible reform. The class-based differences in period management became more pronounced rather than less, creating new forms of inequality. Wealthy women had access to better materials, professional medical care, and private facilities that allowed them to manage their periods with minimal social disruption. Poor women continued to struggle with inadequate resources and public scrutiny that made period management a constant source of stress and potential social problems. Geographic variations also created ongoing issues as women moved between communities with different period management customs. A woman who had grown up with flexible urban approaches might find herself subject to restrictive rural taboos after marriage, while women who moved from traditional communities to more liberal areas might lack the knowledge and resources to take advantage of available options. Perhaps most significantly, the psychological and emotional legacy of centuries of period shame and restriction continued to affect women's relationships with their own bodies. Even when practical restrictions were reduced, many women continued to experience periods as sources of anxiety, embarrassment, and social vulnerability. The internalized shame about periods proved much more resistant to change than the external restrictions and taboos compared to earlier medieval period management. The post-plague developments represented significant progress in practical functionality while maintaining many of the same underlying assumptions about women's bodies and their place in society. The changes were more about accommodation than transformation. Society had learned to work around periods more effectively, but hadn't fundamentally changed its beliefs about what periods meant. When compared to other regions and time periods, European period management during the 5th and 16th centuries shows both progressive and conservative elements. Some Islamic societies of the same period had more sophisticated medical understanding of periods, while maintaining equally restrictive social taboos. Some Asian cultures had developed more effective herbal remedies for period symptoms, while having less flexible social arrangements for managing monthly restrictions. What made European developments unique was the combination of practical innovation driven by economic necessity with continued adherence to religious and cultural beliefs that portrayed periods as spiritually problematic. This created a distinctively European approach that was simultaneously more pragmatic and more contradictory than systems in other cultures. The lessons that could be learned from this period are complex. On one hand, the post-plague experience demonstrated that period restrictions were social constructions that could be modified when circumstances required it. Communities that had been convinced that menstrual contamination was a natural law discovered that they could function perfectly well with more flexible approaches. On the other hand, the persistence of underlying beliefs about periods showed that practical changes didn't automatically lead to conceptual changes. Even when communities had abandoned specific period restrictions, they often retained general assumptions about women's bodies being problematic that justified other forms of discrimination and control. The patterns that repeated elsewhere include the tendency for period management to become more flexible during crisis periods and more restrictive during stable periods, the ongoing tension between practical needs and cultural beliefs, and the role of economic factors in determining how strictly period taboos are enforced. Perhaps most importantly, the European experience showed that period management systems are particularly resistant to change because they involve not just practical considerations, but deeply held beliefs about gender, sexuality, morality, and the relationship between the physical and spiritual aspects of human existence. The comparative analysis also reveals that improvements in period management often came with trade-offs. The commercialization of period care improved access to better materials and professional medical attention, but it also increased economic inequality and reduced community-based support systems. The religious flexibility that allowed for practical accommodations also created theological confusion that left many women uncertain about the moral implications of their period management choices. Modern observers can see clear parallels between medieval European struggles to balance period beliefs with practical reality and contemporary debates about period management in various cultural contexts. The specific beliefs and practices change, but the underlying tensions between cultural traditions and women's practical needs remain remarkably consistent across time and geography. By the late 16th and early 17th centuries, signs pointed to fundamental changes in how European society understood and managed periods, though the transformation was so gradual that most contemporaries didn't recognize it as a historical shift. The elaborate medieval system of period management that had dominated European culture for centuries was slowly giving way to approaches that prioritized scientific observation over theological speculation and practical effectiveness over traditional authority. The most obvious warning sign was the growing disconnect between official doctrine and actual practice. Church authorities continued to write treatises about the spiritual dangers of menstruation, but their guidelines were increasingly ignored by communities that had developed their own workable solutions. Medical authorities still prescribed treatments based on ancient Greek theories, but patients were increasingly seeking care from practitioners who used empirical methods and practical experience. What key players could see versus what they missed reveals the limitations of their worldview. Progressive physicians and natural philosophers could observe that traditional period theories didn't match their clinical observations, but they often couldn't imagine alternatives that completely abandoned the frameworks they had inherited. Women who had developed effective practical solutions could see that official medical advice was often useless or harmful, but they lacked the social authority to challenge medical institutions directly. The resistance to inevitable change came from multiple sources, each with their own reasons for defending traditional approaches. Religious authorities saw period management as connected to broader questions about divine authority and moral order. Changing how society approached periods meant questioning the theological frameworks that justified their influence. Medical institutions had professional and economic interests in maintaining their authority over women's health. Even when their treatments were ineffective, some of the strongest resistance came from communities that had invested heavily in traditional period management systems and couldn't easily abandon the infrastructure they had built around those approaches. Convents that had designed their entire daily routines around period restrictions, guilds that had developed elaborate policies for managing female workers' cycles, and families that had built their social status around strict observance of period. Taboos all had reasons to resist change. The generational divide was particularly stark. Older women who had spent their entire lives navigating traditional period restrictions often defended those systems even when younger women could demonstrate their inadequacy. It's like defending a complicated tax code that you finally learn to navigate, even when someone offers you a simpler system that would work better for everyone. The economic pressures for change were becoming impossible to ignore. The emerging capitalist economy required more predictable and flexible labor arrangements that were incompatible with monthly period-based disruptions. Employers needed workers who could maintain consistent schedules. Traders needed reliable production timelines, and urban families needed more stable household management than traditional period restrictions allowed. Perhaps most importantly, the scientific revolution was beginning to provide alternative frameworks for understanding natural phenomena that didn't require supernatural explanations. The same intellectual movements that were challenging traditional astronomy, physics, and chemistry were also questioning medical theories based on ancient authorities rather than direct observation. The end of the medieval period management system wasn't marked by a single dramatic event, but rather by a gradual shift that unfolded across the 17th and early 18th centuries as the accumulated weight of practical experience, scientific observation, and economic pressure finally overcame traditional authority and religious doctrine. The specific events that marked this transformation varied by region and social class, but they shared common patterns of official authorities quietly abandoning enforcement of traditional restrictions while maintaining the theoretical position that those restrictions remained valid. It was like a gradual administrative surrender where the rules officially remained in place, but everyone agreed to stop following them. One symbolic turning point was the publication of new medical texts that described periods in primarily biological rather than theological terms. These books didn't explicitly reject religious explanations for menstruation, but they focused on practical symptom management and anatomical descriptions that made the spiritual contamination theory seem increasingly irrelevant. The final major players in this transformation included women who had gained enough economic independence to challenge traditional restrictions directly, physicians who were trained in newer empirical methods rather than ancient theoretical frameworks, and employers who needed reliable female workers more than they needed to maintain traditional gender restrictions. The last attempts to preserve traditional period management often took the form of nostalgic revival movements that presented medieval approaches as representing moral purity and social order that had been lost to modern corruption. These movements typically focused on symbolic observances rather than practical restrictions, allowing people to feel like they were maintaining traditional values without actually disrupting their daily routines. Some religious communities made final attempts to maintain strict period restrictions by creating separate institutions where traditional practices could be preserved without interfering with broader social changes. A few convents, conservative Protestant communities, and traditional Jewish households maintained elaborate period management systems well into the 18th century, but these became increasingly isolated from mainstream social practices. The dramatic, final moments of the medieval system often came during specific confrontations between traditional authorities and women who refused to follow period restrictions. Court cases involving women who had been accused of violating period taboos increasingly ended with dismissals or minimal penalties, signaling that legal authorities were no longer willing to enforce traditional restrictions. The gradual decline was more common than sudden endings. Most communities simply stopped enforcing period restrictions that had become impractical without making formal announcements or policy changes. Churches quietly stopped inquiring about women's menstrual status before religious ceremonies. Employers stopped tracking female workers' cycles, and families stopped organizing their household routines around period management. The symbolic endpoints varied, but they often involved the abandonment of physical infrastructure that had been built around period restrictions. Convents removed the separate facilities that had been used to isolate menstruating nuns. Churches eliminated the barriers that had kept menstruating women away from altars, and households stopped maintaining the special supplies and arrangements that had been used for monthly period management. Perhaps the most significant final moment was when period management shifted from being a community responsibility to being a personal matter. Instead of elaborate social protocols involving multiple family members, community authorities, and religious oversight, periods became something that individual women managed, privately with minimal social involvement. The transition wasn't complete or uniform. Different social classes and geographic regions abandoned traditional period management at different rates and to different degrees. Rural areas often maintained traditional practices longer than urban centers. Conservative religious communities preserved restrictions that secular authorities had abandoned, and wealthy families sometimes continued elaborate period protocols as markers of social status even after they were no longer considered necessary. The really fascinating aspect of this ending is how thoroughly it was forgotten once it was complete. Within a generation or two, the elaborate medieval system of period management became so alien to contemporary thinking that people could barely believe it had ever existed. The detailed regulations, theological debates, and social infrastructure that had dominated period management for centuries were dismissed as quaint historical curiosities rather than as serious social institutions that had shaped millions of women's lives. The transformation was so complete that by the 18th century, many people assumed that their contemporary approach to period management was natural and timeless, having little awareness of how dramatically different medieval approaches had been. The collapse of medieval period management wasn't caused by any single factor, but rather by the convergence of scientific, economic, social, and cultural changes that made traditional approaches increasingly untenable and irrelevant to people's actual lives and needs. Internal problems with the medieval system had been accumulating for centuries. The fundamental contradictions between theoretical period doctrines and practical reality had never been resolved, creating constant tension and confusion. The elaborate infrastructure required to maintain period restrictions was expensive and inefficient, consuming resources that could be used more productively for other purposes. The medical inadequacy of traditional period treatments had become impossible to ignore as more women gained access to alternative approaches that actually worked. When village-wise women consistently provided more effective care than university-trained physicians, the authority of official medical institutions was undermined in ways that extended far beyond period management. External pressures were equally important. The emerging capitalist economy required forms of labor flexibility that were incompatible with monthly period-based disruptions. The scientific revolution provided alternative frameworks for understanding natural phenomena that didn't require supernatural explanations. The Protestant Reformation had challenged traditional religious authorities and opened space for questioning other inherited doctrines. The role of individuals versus historical forces is complex and important. While broad social changes created conditions that made transformation possible, the actual abandonment of medieval period management required countless individual decisions by women who chose to ignore traditional restrictions, employers who prioritized practical effectiveness over theoretical contamination, and authorities who decided to stop enforcing rules that no longer served useful purposes. What could have been done differently is an interesting counterfactual question. If medieval authorities had focused more on practical period management and less on theological implications, the elaborate system of restrictions might have evolved more gradually rather than collapsing entirely. If medical institutions had been more responsive to empirical evidence and women's experiences, they might have maintained their authority while adapting their approaches. The question of inevitability versus contingency reveals the complex relationship between cultural beliefs and practical reality. Some aspects of the medieval period management system were clearly unsustainable. The economic inefficiency, medical inadequacy, and logical contradictions created internal pressures that would eventually have forced change regardless of external circumstances. But other aspects might have persisted longer or evolved differently under different conditions. If the scientific revolution had developed differently, if economic changes had proceeded more slowly, or if religious institutions had been more adaptable, the transformation might have taken different forms or followed different timelines. The rapid pace of change, once it began, suggests that much of the medieval system had been maintained through social habit and institutional inertia, rather than genuine conviction. When external pressures forced people to examine their period management practices, many discovered that they had been following elaborate rules without really understanding why those rules existed, or whether they served any useful purpose. The completeness of the transformation, the fact that medieval approaches to period management became almost incomprehensible to later generations, suggests that the old system had fundamental flaws that made it unsurvivable once alternatives became available. It wasn't just that people adopted new approaches. They actively rejected and forgot old approaches that no longer made sense within new frameworks of understanding. Perhaps most importantly, the end of medieval period management demonstrated that deeply embedded cultural practices involving women's bodies and sexuality could be transformed when they became incompatible with broader social and economic needs. This provided a precedent for other changes in gender roles and women's social status that would continue to unfold over subsequent centuries. The immediate aftermath of the medieval period management system's collapse was characterized by uncertainty, experimentation, and the gradual development of new approaches that were more individualized and less socially regulated than their medieval predecessors, who stepped into the vacuum left by the disappearance of traditional period management varied significantly by social class and geographic region. In urban areas, commercial providers of women's health services expanded their offerings to include period management advice and supplies. Professional midwives took on larger roles in providing period-related medical care, while traditional, wise women continued to serve rural and poor communities that couldn't afford professional services. Medical institutions gradually developed new approaches to women's health that were based more on anatomical observation and less on theological speculation. Though the transition was slow, and many practitioners continued to use traditional methods well into the 18th century, the emerging scientific approach to medicine provided new frameworks for understanding periods. But it would be centuries before this translated into significantly better medical care for most women. Short-term consequences included increased diversity in period management approaches as different communities, social classes, and individuals developed their own solutions without the constraints of traditional religious or social authority. This led to innovation and improvement in some areas, but also to confusion and inequality as access to effective period management became more dependent on economic resources and social connections. Contemporary reactions to the transformation were mixed and often confused. Many people welcomed the increased flexibility and reduced restrictions, while others worried that abandoning traditional practices represented moral decline and social chaos. The generation that had grown up with traditional period management often felt disoriented by the rapid changes, while younger people sometimes took the new freedoms for granted without understanding what had changed. Attempts at revival or continuation of traditional period management typically took the form of voluntary observances rather than socially enforced requirements. Some religious communities continued to follow traditional period restrictions as matters of personal piety rather than community obligation, while some families maintained traditional practices as markers of cultural identity or social status. The most significant immediate legacy was the establishment of period management as primarily a private matter rather than a community concern. This represented a fundamental shift in how society understood the relationship between individual bodies and social order, with implications that extended far beyond menstruation to questions about privacy, medical authority, and the role of traditional institutions in governing personal behavior. The rapid development of commercial markets for period-related supplies and services also established precedents for the medicalization and commercialization of women's reproductive health that would continue to evolve over subsequent centuries. The shift from community-based support systems to market-based solutions created new opportunities for innovation and improvement, but also new forms of inequality and dependence that would shape women's experiences for generations to come. Legacy of medieval period management shaped later developments in women's health, medical practice, and gender relations in ways that continued to influence European society for centuries after the medieval system itself had been abandoned. The transformation from elaborate community-based period restrictions to individualized medical management established patterns and precedents that would define women's reproductive health care well into the modern era. One of the most significant long-term influences was the establishment of period management as a primarily medical rather than religious issue. While medieval approaches had been dominated by theological concerns about contamination and spiritual purity, the post-medieval period saw the gradual medicalization of menstruation that treated periods as biological processes requiring medical expertise rather than spiritual management. This medicalization had complex consequences for women's autonomy and authority over their own bodies. On one hand, it provided access to more effective treatments and reduced the social stigma associated with periods. On the other hand, it transferred authority over period management from women themselves and their community networks to male-dominated medical institutions that often had limited understanding of women's actual experiences. The development of commercial markets for period supplies established precedents for the commodification of women's reproductive health that would continue to expand over subsequent centuries. The shift from homemade period materials and community-based support systems to purchase supplies and professional services created new economic relationships around women's bodies that influenced everything from product development to health. Insurance policies. Later generations developed quite different views of medieval period management and the people who had actually lived through those systems. By the 18th and 19th centuries, medieval approaches were often romanticized as representing a more natural and spiritual relationship between women and their bodies, while the practical difficulties and social restrictions were forgotten or minimized. The Victorian era, in particular, developed elaborate myths about medieval period management to portray the Middle Ages as a time when women's reproductive health was more respected and better understood than in the modern industrial period. These myths ignored the actual historical evidence about medieval period restrictions and medical inadequacy, but they influenced Victorian approaches to women's health in ways that sometimes made period management more restrictive rather than less. Academic historians didn't begin serious study of medieval period management until the late 20th century, partly because the topic was considered too intimate and trivial for scholarly attention. When historians finally did examine the evidence, they discovered that medieval approaches had been far more complex, restrictive, and medically inadequate than popular assumptions had suggested. The myths versus realities that developed around medieval periods reveal how historical memory is shaped by contemporary concerns rather than actual historical evidence. Each generation has tended to interpret medieval period management in ways that supported their own arguments about women's health, gender roles, and social organization, often with little regard for what medieval people actually believed or practiced. Modern feminist scholars have been particularly interested in medieval period management as evidence of historical patriarchal control over women's bodies. While conservative commentators have sometimes used romanticized versions of medieval approaches to argue for traditional gender roles and religious authority over reproductive health, the influence on medical education and practice was profound and long-lasting. The medieval precedent of treating periods as primarily theological rather than medical problems contributed to the general neglect of women's health in medical training and research that persisted well into the 20th century. Medical schools continued to provide minimal education about normal menstrual function and period-related health issues, treating them as specialized concerns rather than basic medical knowledge. Why medieval period management remained important to later generations had less to do with its actual effectiveness or historical significance than with its symbolic value in debates about women's roles, medical authority, and the relationship between traditional and modern approaches to health and sexuality. Today, we can see echoes of medieval period management in contemporary debates and practices around the world, revealing that many of the fundamental tensions between cultural beliefs and biological reality have persisted across centuries despite dramatic changes in medical knowledge and social organization. The most obvious parallel is in contemporary societies where period taboos continue to restrict women's activities, from religious communities that maintain separation practices during menstruation to cultures where periods are considered polluting and require isolation or purification. Rituals. These modern restrictions often use the same logic as medieval European approaches. The idea that menstruating women are temporarily dangerous or contaminated in ways that require social management. In many parts of the world, young girls still receive their first period education from older women who pass down traditional beliefs and practices that have changed little over generations, just as medieval girls learned about periods from their mothers and grandmothers. The gap between official medical knowledge and the informal knowledge systems that actually guide women's period management remains significant in many cultural contexts. The persistence of period shame and secrecy in modern societies mirrors the medieval tendency to treat periods as problematic aspects of women's bodies that require concealment and management. Contemporary women often go to great lengths to hide their periods from male family members, co-workers, and social contacts, using euphemisms, concealment strategies, and elaborate logistics that will be familiar to medieval women navigating period taboos. Modern workplace policies around periods reveal similar contradictions to medieval approaches. Many contemporary employers officially acknowledge that periods are normal biological functions, while maintaining workplace cultures that make it difficult for women to manage their periods effectively. The expectation that women should maintain consistent productivity during their periods, regardless of symptoms, parallels medieval economic pressures that required women to work despite period-related restrictions. The commercialization of period management in contemporary consumer culture has created new forms of the same tensions that existed in medieval commercial period supply businesses. Modern women have access to a huge variety of period products, but the marketing of these products often reinforces shame and secrecy rather than promoting open discussion of period management needs. Contemporary debates about period poverty, the inability of some women to afford adequate period supplies, echo medieval concerns about access to clean materials and appropriate period management resources. The basic problem of ensuring that all women have the materials they need to manage their periods safely and hygienically remains unsolved in many parts of the world. What hasn't changed about human nature is the tendency to develop elaborate cultural explanations for biological processes that make people uncomfortable. Modern societies may have abandoned the specific theological frameworks that dominated medieval period management, but they often replace them with medical, psychological, or social theories that serve similar functions in making periods seem controllable and explainable. Similar patterns in different contexts can be seen in how different cultures have developed their own versions of period management systems that reflect local religious beliefs, economic conditions, and social structures while addressing the same basic challenges of managing monthly menstruation within communities that find periods culturally problematic. The persistence of myths about periods in contemporary culture parallels the medieval tendency to base period management on theoretical beliefs rather than empirical observation. Modern myths about periods affecting athletic performance, emotional stability, or cognitive functions serve similar functions to medieval beliefs about menstrual contamination. They provide explanations that justify treating women differently based on their reproductive status. Perhaps most significantly, contemporary debates about period education, medical research, and health policy reveal the same fundamental tensions between treating periods as normal biological functions and treating them as special problems requiring expert management. The medicalization of periods in modern healthcare often recreates some of the same authority relationships and knowledge gaps that characterized medieval period management. The lessons for contemporary issues include recognition that period management systems reflect broader cultural attitudes about women's bodies, gender roles, and social organization rather than just medical or practical considerations. Improving period management requires addressing cultural beliefs and social structures, not just developing better products or medical treatments. Modern societies that have made significant progress in normalizing periods and improving period management have typically done so by combining practical improvements in materials and medical care with cultural changes that reduce period shame and increase women's authority over their own reproductive health decisions. Even now, medieval approaches to period management continue to influence contemporary institutions, popular culture, and social attitudes in ways that are often subtle but significant. The long historical tradition of treating periods as problematic aspects of women's bodies that require special management has created cultural assumptions that persist even when the specific beliefs that justified those assumptions have been abandoned. Academic study of medieval period management has influenced contemporary feminist scholarship, women's health advocacy, and historical research methods. The recognition that periods have their own complex social and cultural history has encouraged scholars to examine other aspects of women's reproductive health that were previously ignored or dismissed as unimportant to historical understanding. Popular culture continues to reference medieval period beliefs, often in ways that romanticize or misrepresent historical practices. Contemporary media representations of medieval women sometimes perpetuate myths about period management that bear little resemblance to historical reality. But these representations influence public understanding of both medieval history and contemporary period issues. Political discourse about women's reproductive health often invokes historical precedents, sometimes using medieval examples to support arguments about traditional gender roles or to demonstrate the historical persistence of patriarchal control over women's bodies. These political uses of medieval period history are usually more rhetorical than historical, but they shape contemporary policy debates. Social movements focused on period equity, menstrual health advocacy, and reproductive rights often draw lessons from historical period management to demonstrate the constructed nature of period shame and to argue for more progressive approaches. The historical evidence that period restrictions were social conventions rather than natural laws provides support for contemporary efforts to normalize periods and improve period management. Why people still care about medieval period management reflects contemporary concerns about gender equality, bodily autonomy, and the relationship between traditional beliefs and modern scientific knowledge. The medieval period provides a clear example of how societies can create elaborate systems of control around women's bodies, based on beliefs that seem obviously false from contemporary perspectives. The continuing relevance of medieval period history also reflects the incomplete nature of contemporary progress in period management. Many of the fundamental issues that medieval women faced, access to adequate supplies, social stigma, inadequate medical care, and the tension between cultural beliefs and practical needs, remain unresolved for many women today, making medieval experiences surprisingly relevant to contemporary struggles. Looking back across our journey through medieval period management, we've seen a fascinating tapestry of human ingenuity, cultural complexity, and the eternal struggle between practical necessity and elaborate social conventions. From the theological debates of learned abbesses to the underground period clinics of village-wise women, from the crisis management of noble households to the gradual transformation following the Black Death, medieval approaches to menstruation reveal fundamental patterns about how societies create, maintain, and eventually abandon complex systems of belief and practice around women's bodies. The key patterns that emerged include the persistent tension between treating periods as both natural and problematic, the gap between official doctrine and practical reality, and remarkable creativity that people displayed in developing solutions to problems that their own cultural beliefs had created. Medieval Europeans managed to construct an elaborate superstructure of period-related rules, restrictions, and rituals while simultaneously developing practical workarounds that allowed their communities to function despite the theoretical impossibility of doing so. Perhaps most surprising was discovering how sophisticated and interconnected medieval women's knowledge networks were. Despite operating in a society that officially considered women intellectually inferior and spiritually dangerous, the informal systems of period management, medical care, and mutual support that women created were often more effective than the official institutions that claimed authority over women's health. The most important takeaways include recognition that period management systems reflect broader cultural assumptions about gender, power, and social organization rather than just medical or practical considerations. The medieval experience demonstrates that even deeply embedded cultural practices can be transformed when they become incompatible with economic and social realities, but also that such transformations often take centuries and leave lasting legacies. How? Our understanding has evolved throughout this. Exploration reveals the importance of examining historical topics that have been traditionally ignored or dismissed. Medieval period management wasn't just a quirky historical curiosity. It was a complex social system that affected millions of women's daily lives and shaped broader patterns of gender relations, medical practice, and cultural development. The journey also revealed how historical memory can be shaped by contemporary concerns rather than historical evidence. Popular assumptions about medieval period management often reflect modern anxieties about gender roles and women's health rather than actual medieval beliefs and practices. The gap between historical reality and contemporary mythology about periods demonstrates the importance of evidence-based historical research. Perhaps most importantly, the medieval period management story illustrates the remarkable resilience and adaptability of human communities. Despite operating with inadequate medical knowledge, primitive technology, and cultural beliefs that created unnecessary problems, medieval people developed practical solutions that allowed their societies to function and their communities to survive. Their experiences provide both cautionary tales about the dangers of allowing cultural beliefs to override practical reality and inspiring examples of human creativity in the face of seemingly impossible social and cultural constraints. Let me leave you with one final story that encapsulates everything we've discovered about medieval period management. Drawn from the household records of a 5th-10th century English manor that had survived the transition from medieval restrictions to more practical approaches. In 1487, the manor of Whitmore experienced what the steward described as the Great Period Crisis of the harvest season. It was late September, the crucial time when the entire community needed to work together to bring in the grain before the autumn rains could destroy the crop. But a convergence of bad luck meant that nearly all the women in the village were menstruating simultaneously, a statistical anomaly that would have been merely inconvenient in modern times, but was potentially catastrophic under traditional medieval period restrictions. According to the old rules, these women couldn't touch the grain, work in the fields, or handle the harvesting tools. They were supposed to remain in isolation while the men and the few non-menstruating women attempted to complete the harvest alone. But the manor simply didn't have enough people to handle the work without the restricted women. Then everyone knew that losing the harvest meant facing starvation during the winter. The steward's records show the agonizing decision-making process that followed. The village priest initially insisted that the traditional restrictions had to be maintained regardless of practical consequences, arguing that violating period taboos would bring divine punishment that would be worse than losing the harvest. The manor lord, who lived in London and understood the economic implications, sent word that the harvest had to be completed by any means necessary. The village women, led by an elderly grandmother named Alice, who had lived through the plague and subsequent social changes, essentially staged what we might now call a menstrual rebellion. They announced that they would work in the fields during their periods, with or without official permission, because feeding their families was more important than following rules that made no practical sense. The fascinating part is how the community adapted to this unprecedented situation. They developed an elaborate system of compromises that technically preserved the spiritual restrictions while allowing the practical work to continue. The menstruating women wore special blessed clothing, used tools that had been consecrated by the priest, and worked in designated areas of the fields that could be ritually purified after the harvest was complete. The harvest was saved. The community survived the winter, and everyone learned that period restrictions were more flexible than they had previously believed. But the really interesting aftermath was that the village quietly abandoned most of their traditional period restrictions over the following years, without ever officially acknowledging that they had changed their practices. The steward's final entry about this incident is both practical and poetic. The women's monthly affliction proved less dangerous to our harvest than the September rains would have been, and perhaps less troublesome than the elaborate precautions we had previously taken to avoid it. This year we learned that necessity makes philosophers of us all, and that God's work sometimes requires setting aside man's rules. This story perfectly captures the themes we've explored throughout our journey: the tension between cultural beliefs and practical reality, the creativity that people displayed in finding workable solutions, the role of women's agency in transforming restrictive systems, and the gradual nature of social change. It also demonstrates how historical transformation often happens not through dramatic announcements or policy changes, but through countless small decisions by ordinary people who choose practical effectiveness over traditional authority. And so we reach the end of our exploration into the surprisingly complex world of medieval period management. From theological contamination theories to underground period clinics, from noble household crises to village menstrual rebellions, we've seen how our ancestors navigated the monthly realities of menstruation with creativity, resilience, and occasional absurdity. Perhaps the most remarkable discovery is how much medieval women achieved despite the elaborate obstacles their society placed in their path. They developed sophisticated networks of mutual support, created effective medical treatments, and gradually transformed restrictive social systems through persistent practical innovation. Their experiences remind us that progress often comes not from dramatic revolutions, but from countless individual acts of quiet rebellion against rules that don't serve human needs. As you drift off to sleep tonight, remember that history is full of people who faced seemingly impossible situations and found ways to make them work. The medieval approach to periods was far from perfect, but it demonstrates the remarkable human capacity to adapt, survive, and eventually improve the systems we inherit. Sweet dreams. And remember, you're living in the golden age of period management, even if it doesn't always feel that way.